They gave him 24 hours to leave, but the mountains had been waiting for him his whole life. When a forgotten veteran and his steadfast dog were cast into the frozen wilds of British Columbia, with nothing but a half-empty pack in each other, nobody expected them to last the night. But somewhere deep in the Chilcotin range, they found a way to fight back against winter itself. Before we begin, drop a comment below and tell me where you're listening from, your city, your province, your country. I'd love to see how far this story reaches. The notice arrived on a Tuesday, which felt about right. Nothing good ever happened to Virgil Dunne on a Tuesday. The property manager stood on the front step of the rooming house with a manila envelope and the kind of expression people wear when they'd rather be anywhere else. Virgil opened the door before the man could knock, because Boone had already heard him coming up the stairs, the dog's ears rotating like satellite dishes, a low rumble building in his chest. The manager cleared his throat. "Mr. Dunne, building's been sold. New owners want vacant possession. You've got until end of day tomorrow." Virgil stared at the envelope without touching it. Behind him, the one-bedroom unit held everything he owned, which wasn't much. A cot, a duffel bag, a hot plate he'd bought at a church sale, and the dog. Always the dog. "That's not legal," Virgil said, though his voice carried no fight. The manager shrugged. "There's a number in there for tenant services. I'm just the messenger." He set the envelope on the railing and left without looking back. Virgil stood in the doorway for a long time after. The November air off the Fraser Valley carried that particular damp cold that crawled under your collar and stayed. Boone pressed against his leg, warm and solid, waiting for a signal. Virgil reached down and rested his hand on the dog's broad skull. "All right," he said quietly. "We've started over before." He spent that night packing, which took less than an hour. The rest of the time he sat on the edge of the cot, running his thumb along the seam of his old field jacket, the one he'd worn through 2 tours and 3 Canadian winters since. His hands shook, not from the cold but from something deeper. A tremor that lived in his nervous system like a tenant that refused to leave. Boone lay across his feet, chin resting on Virgil's boot, brown eyes, tracking every shift of his person's breathing. By morning, Virgil had made a decision, not a good one maybe, but the only one that made sense. He wasn't going to another shelter. He wasn't going to stand in another line, fill out another form, explain his situation to another clipboard. He'd done that dance for 3 years since coming back, and it had landed him here, in a room that wasn't even his anymore. He was going north, into the mountains, into the cold. He shouldered the duffel and whistled once. Boone fell in beside him, matching his stride the way he'd done since the day Virgil pulled him from that rescue shelter in Kamloops, a skinny, anxious shepherd with trust issues and a bite history. 2 broken things finding each other, as it turned out. They hitched a ride on a logging truck as far as Totla Lake, then walked. The road turned to gravel, then to dirt, then to nothing. The Chilcotin Plateau stretched around them in every direction, vast and indifferent, the mountains rising ahead like a wall of gray teeth. Virgil's knee protested every step, an old injury from a convoy accident that the VA had rated at 30%, which meant they acknowledged it existed, but didn't think it mattered much. By late afternoon, the temperature had dropped hard. Virgil could feel it in his chest first, the way he always did, that tightening around the scar tissue where shrapnel had nicked his left lung 15 years ago. Each breath came a little shorter, a little sharper. Boone noticed before Virgil did, slowing his pace, glancing back every few steps. "I'm fine," Virgil told him. Boone didn't look convinced. They camped that first night under a stand of Douglas fir, where the canopy blocked the worst of the wind. Virgil built a small fire with hands that wouldn't stop trembling. The lighter took 6 tries. When the flame finally caught, he sat so close to it that sparks landed on his jacket and he didn't care. Boone curled against his side, radiating heat like a furnace. Virgil pulled the dog close and stared up through the branches at a sky packed with more stars than he'd seen in years. The silence was enormous. No traffic, no voices through thin walls, no television bleeding through from the unit next door. just wind and the distant complaint of a creek somewhere below them. "This is either the smartest thing I've done," Virgil whispered, "or the last thing." Boone sighed through his nose, long and slow, and pressed closer. They pushed deeper into the range the next morning. The terrain climbed steeply, switchbacking through stands of spruce and cedar, the ground thick with frost-stiffened moss. Virgil's breath came in white bursts. His pack straps cut into shoulders that weren't as broad as they'd been at 40 or even 50, but his eyes stayed sharp, scanning the landscape the way they'd been trained to, reading the land for shelter, water, threats. It was Boone who found it. The dog had been ranging ahead, nose to the ground. When he stopped abruptly at the base of a rocky outcrop, his body went rigid, ears forward, tail level. Not alarmed. Virgil knew the difference. Interested. "What've you got?" Virgil called, picking his way over a fallen log. Behind a curtain of dead vine maple, the rock face opened into a dark mouth, wide at the base, narrowing upward beneath an overhang of weathered granite. The entrance faced south, sheltered from the prevailing wind. Virgil crouched and peered inside. The ground was dry, bone dry. He could feel cool air moving faintly from somewhere deeper in, which meant ventilation. He rapped his knuckles against the stone and listened to the echo travel back, deep and hollow. Boone stepped inside ahead of him, disappearing into the shadows with the confidence of a dog who trusted his nose more than his eyes. Virgil followed. The cave opened into a chamber roughly 30 feet deep, the ceiling high enough to stand in. The walls were smooth where water had shaped them over centuries, and the floor was covered in a thick layer of dry pine needles blown in by years of wind. Near the back, a narrow crack in the ceiling let in a thin column of gray light. Virgil stood in the center of the space and exhaled. His breath didn't fog as badly in here. The stone held a kind of neutral stillness, not warm but absent of wind, absent of the cutting damp that had been eating through his jacket for 2 days. "This'll do," he said. His voice sounded strange to him, almost hopeful. He wasn't used to that. The first 2 days were about the wall. Virgil dragged deadfall from the surrounding slope, trimming branches with his belt knife and stacking logs across the cave mouth until he had a barrier chest high. It wasn't pretty. The gaps between logs let in threads of cold air, and the whole structure leaned slightly inward, but cut the wind by half, and half was the difference between sleeping and shivering through another night. Boone helped the way Boone helped with everything, by staying close and staying calm. He dragged smaller branches to the entrance, gripping them in his jaws and backing up with a seriousness that made Virgil laugh for the first time in weeks. When Virgil's arms gave out and he had to sit against the rock face, breathing through a coughing fit that bent him double, Boone pressed his head against Virgil's chest and held it there until the spasm passed. "Easy," Virgil gasped, hand finding the dog's ear. "I'm all right. Just the cold getting in." But it wasn't just the cold. The shrapnel scar pulled tight when he worked too hard, and his lungs hadn't been right since the blast. Some nights he woke coughing so violently that he tasted iron. He never mentioned it to anyone, because there was no one to mention it to. Except Boone, who already knew the fire was the real problem. Virgil built a ring of stones near the center of the cave and arranged kindling with careful hands. He lit it, and for about 30 seconds, it burned beautifully clean orange flames climbing through the dry wood. Then the smoke hit the ceiling and had nowhere to go. It pooled, thickened, and rolled back down like a gray tide, filling the cave from the top down. Virgil's lungs seized. He stumbled backward, eyes streaming, coughing so hard his vision went white at the edges. Boone barked, sharp and panicked, pawing at Virgil's arm, trying to drag him toward the entrance. They spilled outside together, Virgil on his hands and knees, the dog circling him frantically. It took 2 full minutes before he could breathe without wheezing. He sat in the dirt with his back against the rock, chest heaving, smoke still drifting lazily from the cave, mouth like the place was exhaling its rejection. He wanted to hit something. Wanted to scream into the tree line and let the mountains throw his voice back at him. Instead, he pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes and stayed very still. "Why can't one thing just work?" he whispered. "Just one thing." Boone sat facing him, quiet now, watching. After a while, the dog leaned forward and licked the tears off Virgil's wrist, a gesture so simple and deliberate that it cracked something open inside him. Virgil watched the last wisps of smoke drift from the cave. Most of it curled upward, toward the overhang, but a thin ribbon pulled sideways, toward a narrow seam in the rock about 8 feet up on the left wall. Not the ceiling crack he'd noticed earlier, a different one, angled, running upward at maybe 45 degrees. He stared at it for a long time. Then he stood. It took the rest of that day and most of the next. Virgil gathered flat stones from the creek bed and hauled them up the slope 2 and 3 at a time, his back screaming, his knee threatening to buckle. He built a crude channel beneath the seam, a funnel of stacked stone packed with clay he dug from the stream bank, directing the smoke toward the natural draft. The work was slow and miserable, and he had to stop every 20 minutes to catch his breath. Boone stayed beside him the entire time, sometimes carrying smaller stones in his mouth, sometimes just sitting near Virgil's elbow with a patience that felt almost sacred. When Virgil lit the fire again, the smoke rose, hesitated, then curled toward the funnel and was pulled upward through the fissure. Not perfectly. Some still leaked, but the cave didn't fill. The air stayed breathable. The flame burned steady. Virgil sat beside it and held his hands to the warmth. Boone lay next to him, his fur glowing orange in the firelight. Neither of them moved for a long time. That night, Virgil slept without coughing. The fire crackled gently. The cave held. Food became urgent on the 4th day. Virgil's supplies were nearly gone. A handful of trail mix, 2 cans of beans he'd been rationing, a sleeve of stale crackers. Boone needed calories badly. The dog was lean to begin with, and the work of the last few days had cost him. Virgil gave Boone the last of the beans and ate the crackers himself, trying not to think about what came next. He followed the creek downstream, until he found a stretch where the water widened into a shallow pool edged with sand. He saw them immediately, dark shapes hovering in the calmer water. Trout, not large but real. The problem was the current. It pushed through too fast for the fish to hold still, and the pool was too shallow to trap them. Virgil crouched on the bank, studying the flow the way he'd once studied terrain maps, looking for the line of least resistance. A dam, just a small one, enough to deepen the pool and slow the water. He and Boone spent 2 days building it. Virgil stacked rocks in a crescent arc across the stream, pressing them tight, filling gaps with gravel and mud. The water fought him constantly, numbing his hands, soaking through his boots. More than once he slipped on the wet stones and went down hard, the cold water hitting his chest like a fist. The worst moment came near the end of the 2nd day. Virgil was wading knee-deep, setting the last row of stones, when his foot slipped between 2 rocks and his leg twisted sharply. The pain was instantaneous and blinding. He went down sideways, the current shoving him against the dam, icy water surging over his chest and into his face. Boone didn't hesitate. The dog launched from the bank, hit the water with a splash, and clamped his jaws on Virgil's jacket collar. He pulled backward with a force that seemed impossible for a 70-pound dog, his hind legs scrambling on the slick stones, growling through clenched teeth. Virgil grabbed the dam's edge with one numb hand and hauled himself up. They collapsed on the bank together, soaking, shaking. Virgil gasping while Boone stood over him, dripping and wild-eyed. "You're something else," Virgil panted. "You know that?" Boone shook himself violently, spraying water everywhere, then licked Virgil's face with an urgency that said, "Don't do that again." The dam held. By the next morning, the pool behind it had deepened into a still, dark mirror. Shadows glided beneath the surface, slow and fat. Virgil fashioned a spear from a straight branch, sharpened the tip with his knife, and stood barefoot in the shallows, waiting. The first trout took 3 tries, the second only 1. By midday he had 4 fish laid out on a flat rock, their scales catching the thin November sun. He cleaned them by the water's edge, saving the heads and guts in a separate pile. Nothing wasted. He'd learned that a long time ago. He roasted 2 fish over the hearth that evening, the smell filling the cave with something warm and alive. Boone ate his share in approximately 4 seconds, then sat, watching Virgil eat with the expression of a dog, who believed seconds were not only possible but morally required. Virgil tossed him another piece. Don't get used to the restaurant service. He smoked the remaining fish over the fire that night, hanging them from a stick balanced across 2 rocks. Tomorrow he'd set snares along the rabbit trails he'd noticed upslope. The next day he'd check the deadfall near the creek for grouse sign. The mountain was feeding them, but only if they paid attention. The storm announced itself 3 days later, not with wind or snow, but with silence. The birds stopped. The creek seemed to quiet. The air pressure dropped so fast. Virgil felt it in his sinuses, a dull squeeze behind his eyes. He looked at the sky and saw it, a wall of cloud rolling over the peaks from the northwest, bruised and heavy. Boone stood rigid at the cave entrance, every muscle taut. "That's a bad one," Virgil said quietly. He spent the next 6 hours hauling firewood, every dead branch, every dry stump, every piece of bark he could strip and carry. His body begged him to stop, his knee swollen, his chest burning, his hands raw and blistered. But he kept going because the mountain didn't negotiate. When he'd stacked enough wood to fill a quarter of the cave, he reinforced the wall, wedging new logs into the gaps and packing them with frozen mud. The first snowflakes fell at dusk, soft, almost gentle. By full dark, the wind arrived, and it wasn't gentle at all. The storm hit like something alive and furious. Wind screamed across the ridge, hammering the cliff face, driving snow horizontally through every crack in the wall. The temperature plummeted. Inside the cave, the fire burned stubbornly, but the cold pressed in from every direction, a physical weight against the stone. Virgil huddled near the hearth with Boone pressed against his side. The dog's ears lay flat, his body vibrating with tension. Virgil stroked his flank slowly, rhythmically, as much for his own comfort as the dog's. Around midnight, the chimney failed. He smelled it first, the sharp, acrid bite of smoke where there shouldn't be smoke. The flames in the hearth bent sideways, then downward. Gray clouds poured from the stone funnel, filling the cave with choking haze. Virgil's lungs caught fire. He doubled over, coughing so hard he saw spots. Boone barked, frantic, pulling at his sleeve. The vents blocked, Virgil rasped. Snow on top, he knew it immediately. The wind had packed snow over the fissures' exit, sealing their chimney shut. He had to go outside. In this, he shoved the door logs aside and pushed into the storm. The wind hit him like a wall of frozen sand, stealing his breath, his balance, his sense of direction. Snow swirled so thick he couldn't see his own hands. He pressed against the cliff face and climbed, fingers clawing at ice-slicked rock, boots scraping for purchase. Boone tried to follow. Virgil heard him barking below, sharp, terrified. "Stay," Virgil shouted into the wind. "Stay there." He reached the ledge above the cave by feel alone, hands numb, face burning. The fissure was buried under a foot of packed snow. He dug with his bare hands, smashing through the crust, his fingers screaming. Ice tore at his knuckles. The wind shoved him sideways and he grabbed a rock spur with both hands, hanging on through a gust that tried to peel him off the mountain. When the last chunk of ice broke free, smoke erupted from the vent, a dark plume ripped apart instantly by the wind. The chimney breathed again. Getting down was worse. His hands had gone white, past pain, past feeling. His legs moved like they belonged to someone else. He half fell the last 6 feet, landing in the snowdrift that had piled against the cave entrance. Boone was there immediately, whining, licking his hands, pressing his warm body against Virgil's frozen chest. They crawled back inside together. Virgil collapsed beside the fire, shaking so violently his teeth rattled. Boone draped himself across Virgil's torso, covering as much of him as possible, sharing heat with a desperation that went beyond instinct. It took an hour before the shaking eased. Virgil lay on the stone floor, staring at the ceiling, listening to the storm howl outside. His fingers throbbed as feeling returned, an exquisite burning pain that meant they were still alive. "You keep saving me," he whispered to the dog. Boone rested his chin on Virgil's collarbone and exhaled long and warm. The storm raged for 2 more days. Inside the cave, Virgil and Boone existed in a kind of suspended state, feeding the fire, eating smoked fish, sleeping in short stretches, listening to the mountain throw everything it had at their little pocket of warmth. The wall held. The chimney, once cleared, drew steady. The dam, Virgil knew, would be buried under ice, but it would still be there when the thaw came. On the 3rd morning, silence. Virgil pushed open the door and stepped into a world remade. The forest was buried. Trees bent under impossible loads of snow, their branches touching the ground. The sky was a clean, hard blue, so bright it hurt. Everything sparkled, crystalline, infinite. Boone bounded into the snow with pure, stupid joy, disappearing up to his ears, surfacing with a snort, plunging back in. Virgil watched him and laughed, a real laugh, rusty and surprised. A figure appeared on the ridge above, moving slowly with a walking stick. Virgil tensed, one hand reaching for his knife. But Boone's tail was wagging, which meant something. The man came down the slope with the careful steps of someone who'd walked mountain terrain for decades. He was old, older than Virgil, with a weathered face and a wool coat patched at the elbows. A canvas bag hung from one shoulder. "Morning," the man called, voice carrying a calm warmth. "Saw your smoke before the storm. Been hoping you made it through." Virgil didn't answer right away. His instinct was to keep distance, to keep quiet. But the old man's eyes held no threat, only the steady, unsurprised gaze of someone who'd seen hard living and recognized it in others. "Name's Angus Firth," the man said. "Got a place about 4 kilometers north. Been up here since before they built the highway." Virgil Dunne. Angus studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Military? Long time ago. Shows. Not the bad way. Just the way a man holds himself when he's used to operating on fumes and still getting up." He held out the canvas bag. "Brought you a few things. Didn't know if you'd have food." Inside the bag were 2 jars of canned salmon, a round of bannock wrapped in cloth, dried venison, a tin of tea leaves, and a pair of wool mittens, hand-knit, thick as armor. Virgil stared at it. His throat tightened. "I can't take this," he managed. "Sure you can," Angus said simply. "I've got more than I need, and you've got less. That's how it works up here." Boone sniffed the bannock through the cloth and wagged his tail. "Smart dog," Angus said, scratching behind Boone's ear. "He looks after you." Virgil swallowed. "He's the reason I'm standing here." Angus glanced at the cave, at the wall, at the smoke drifting cleanly from the vent. "You've done real work here. Most people would have turned around after the first night. Most people have somewhere to turn around to." Angus was quiet a moment, then he said, "Fair enough. But you've got somewhere now." Before he left, Angus paused on the slope. "One thing. There's been a pair of men running trap lines up past the North Ridge. Poaching, most likely. Rough types. Don't go looking for trouble, but keep your eyes open." Virgil nodded. "I'll keep my distance." Angus tipped his hat. "I'll check in after the next snowfall. You and that dog take care of each other." Virgil watched him climb the ridge until his figure dissolved into the white landscape. Something shifted in his chest, not pain this time, but something warmer, something that had been frozen for a long time and was beginning, just barely, to thaw. The days that followed found a rhythm. Virgil woke each morning, rebuilt the fire, stepped outside to check the sky. He and Boone walked the trap line he'd set, along the game trail above the cave, checking snares for rabbit, scanning the snow for grouse tracks. He reinforced the dam with fresh stones, once the surface ice thinned enough to work. Fish returned to the deeper pool within days. He smoked everything he caught, hanging strips of trout and rabbit over the hearth until the cave smelled like a smokehouse. Boone hunted too in his way. The dog had a talent for flushing ptarmigan from brush piles, sending them whirring into the open where Virgil could throw a stone or set a snare path. They worked together without speaking, the way only 2 creatures who've shared silence long enough can. Virgil began to feel something he hadn't felt in years. Not happiness exactly, something quieter, a settling. Like the tremor in his hands was finally meeting a counterweight. One evening, after a meal of roasted trout and bannock heated over the fire, Virgil took his field knife and knelt beside the cave wall. In slow, careful strokes, he carved into the stone, built by two soldiers. One spoke, one didn't need to. Boone padded over and sniffed the carving, tail swaying once. "That's ours," Virgil said softly. "Nobody's takes that." He leaned back against the wall, the fire painting the cave in amber. Boone settled against his side, heavy and warm. Outside, the Chilcotin range stretched in every direction, silent under snow, ancient and vast and completely indifferent to the small pocket of warmth that had taken root in its stone. And that was all right. Virgil didn't need the mountain to care. He just needed it to hold still long enough for him and Boone to keep building. The fire crackled. The chimney drew true. The dog breathed slow and steady against his ribs. And Virgil Dunne, 63 years old, broken in ways the world had stopped counting, closed his eyes and felt, for the first time in longer than he could remember, like he might just make it. Not because he was strong. He wasn't. Not anymore. Because he wasn't alone. Later that night, Boone lifted his head sharply, ears snapping forward. He stared toward the back of the cave where the firelight didn't reach. Virgil followed his gaze. At the far wall, half hidden by shadow, a thin draft moved through a seam between two slabs of granite. Not upward, like the chimney vent. Outward. Virgil pressed his palm flat against the stone. Behind it, hollow. Space. Something deeper. He looked at Boone. Boone looked back, tail stiff. Not afraid, but ready. "Guess this mountain isn't finished with us yet," Virgil murmured. The cave breathed around them, ancient and patient, holding its secrets the way old mountains do, giving them up only to those stubborn enough to stay. If you made it all the way to the end, thank you. Before you go, drop a quick comment below, even just a 0 or a 1. So I know you were here with Virgil and Boone until the very last word. Your comments tell YouTube this story matters. And if you want to follow their journey deeper into the mountain, make sure you subscribe to the channel. More stories of resilience, loyalty, and second chances are coming. I'll see you in the next one.